All right, claim 5 then is the last claim in this particular chapter, right? So we've worked our way now through the first 4 claims, and now we come to claim 5. Now again, this chapter is talking about, is the Bible full of irresolvable contradictions, right? This is what chapter 2 is all about. So the 5th claim here says that the diversity of views within the New Testament indicates that Jesus was not originally considered, here it is, ready, to be God in any sense at all. He eventually became divine for his followers in some sense before he came to be thought of as equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense. So the idea here is there is a progression, and we'll see it here in this chapter as we go, right? Yeah. Jesus wasn't originally thought to be God, and then he eventually became God, something like that, right?
And again, if you've watched any of Bart Ehrman's presentations or debates, he always has that one joke that he repeats all the time, is that John's the only one where it talks about him being divine, because Jesus says, I am divine and you are the branches. I've heard it so many times. It's a good joke once, but it's hard just to hear it over and over again. So Bart Ehrman has experienced somewhat of an evolution himself on the subject of Christology. In Jesus Interrupted, which was published in 2009, he claims John is our only gospel that actually speaks of Jesus as divine, and argues that this belief was particular to the late first century community from which John's gospel originated. However, in Ehrman's most recent book, How Jesus Became God, he now recognizes that belief in Jesus' divinity was remarkably early. The catch is that he believes this early view meant something far less significant than what most Christians now mean by referring to Jesus' divinity. So there's the trade-off.
Yeah, good. So Ehrman argues for a trajectory in early Christian thought that evolved from Jesus being not God in any sense at all, right, to him being divine in some sense, to him being equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense, right? So you have this kind of what he calls a pyramid, right? While Ehrman's provocative proposal might play well to those who are hungry for a conspiracy theory, a closer look reveals problems with his reading of the evidence. We'll start with 2 preliminary issues concerning how Ehrman makes his argument in how Jesus became God, right? So we have this progression here, this evolution in terms of how Jesus became God in the eyes of those who believed in him, right?
So our authors say that first, Ehrman makes the case by painting a rather monolithic portrait of scholarship on this issue.
Right. So this is what everybody believes, right? All the scholars believe this, right? They're on my side.
So with his all too common rhetoric, he implies that there are sober-minded, realistic historians, that is, the majority of critical scholars, who for more than a century have maintained that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet and concur that Jesus didn't even claim to be divine.
Yeah, this is just what they all said.
And so, I just had this discussion with someone on our YouTube comments, and obviously once answered, you fall down a rabbit hole into more and more things that you pick apart and say, in 325, it's 16, all but 16 bishops said that Jesus wasn't divine. Yeah. Well, no, that's the whole Da Vinci Code thing. That's not accurate.
Right. And didn't happen.
And again, they weren't coming to discuss whether or not this is the case. It was a clarification on language in response to heresies out there from the Gnostics.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, all of a sudden Jesus is divine. Here we go. Let's send that out.
Right. So, all the scholars believe, we've seen this kind of deal before. Right. So the problem is that Ehrman, once again, has not really given his readers the whole story.
The rest of the story.
That's right. In fact, on the same day that his book, How Jesus Became God, was released, a 5-scholar team published a full-fledged response to Ehrman.
Yeah.
Right? So Ehrman should not claim to speak for the majority of serious scholars when his responses includes 5 first-rate scholars who teach on 3 continents and in 4 countries, Australia, Canada, England, the United States, and institutions such as Cambridge University, right? So clearly not all scholars believe, right?
So his is how God became Jesus. No, Jesus became God.
How God became Jesus.
Right. That's his.
Oh, that's the scholars. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Good play on words.
Yeah. So his was how Jesus became God.
And how God became Jesus.
And their response was how God became
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, nice.
Yeah. And so it does a good job, and we provide the links below if you want to purchase that. Second, Ehrman's approach to the process of historical inquiry predetermines that he will reach skeptical conclusions about the person of Jesus. So again, what do we always talk about? Presuppositions. Presuppositions help inform what you allow in, what you keep out. And so that's what he's doing here. In the revealing section of how Jesus became God, Ehrman explains his approach to history. He writes this: "It is not appropriate for a historian to presuppose a perspective or worldview that is not generally held." So the question is, generally held by whom, right?
Yeah.
That's the big thing. If you're gonna kind of count heads, count noses, I think you say, then do you count all believers? Oh well, no, they're not scholarly.
Right.
Okay, well, what about those who have come before? Well, no, those don't count because this is modern scholarship.
Right.
Okay, well, what about those who are doing modern scholarship who are believers? Well, no, they don't count because they're biased.
Right.
Okay, well, you keep drawing your circle smaller, and then you say, well,
So these are the scholars,
Yeah.
right? These are all the scholars.
Right.
Yeah.
Not saying that he's a lone wolf out there in the desert, but it's saying it's not taking into a full menagerie of different perspectives that you should want to respond against. Later he writes, historically and established by historians is based on shared presuppositions. So again, presuppositions don't matter, but then they do matter. And so we would agree, yes, they do matter. And so you should at least be clear that, hey, with my presuppositions in place, I don't take Bible-believing scholars as being the best, because I want someone who comes at this from a skeptical standpoint. So only what the skeptics say is
right.
when they say this actually happened, then you can take it to the bank.
That's right, because he was a skeptic.
Right.
So for Ehrman, historical inquiry cannot allow for any possibility and certainly not point to any conclusion that God is involved in the world in specific ways, right? Hence, historic Christian conclusions are off the table before anyone ever sits down at the table.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So even though Ehrman's justification for such a move is kind of far from convincing, right? There are plenty of historians who do not share his naturalistic presuppositions, right? In other words, if we say that God, the idea that God is involved in the world in specific ways has to be taken off the table. Well, wait a minute. Now we have some presuppositions. So, in other words, no supernatural events can happen.
Right.
Therefore, only natural events, we have to explain this naturally. Well, wait a minute. Yeah. Why can't no supernatural events happen?
I don't want to seat at that table.
Yeah.
You've essentially taken my response from me. I don't appreciate that.
Yeah.
And we see this similar thing with things like the Jesus Seminar. And so they put their little pebble into a jar and they say, well, when it says Jesus walked on water, it really means he walked by the water. And then people can go out and say, well, modern scholarship has said that what the best translation of this is that Jesus walked on the water, or walked by the water.
Yes.
So he's walking on the shore, so his feet get a little wet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's it.
So why do that? Because supernatural events are off the table. Right.
But if they put their little white pebble in, then here it's you can take that one to the bank because they're so skeptical that you don't get the whole New Testament in there.
Right, and so again, there are plenty of scholars who don't share this naturalistic presupposition that he has. Right. Yeah.
So, however, we want to direct attention to some issues with the major planks of his argument. First, in contrast, Ehrman's claim Christianity did not elevate Jesus to a demigod, this small g, as a result of interface with pagan and Jewish traditions, and as an initial step towards being recognized later as a big G God.
Right. So the claim here is that, well, at first, because of the pagan and Jewish traditions that were going around at the time, Christianity only thought that Jesus was kind of a demigod. Right. They were so influenced by the Greeks and the Jews and that sort of thing that this is what they came up with. Right.
And this is more the Gnostic understanding of who Jesus is, the demiurge, and is referring to the Old Testament God as this malicious smaller deity that seems different than Yahweh out there.
Yeah, right. So they were so influenced, right? The problem here is that Ehrman is skipping too quickly over the uniqueness of the Christians' claims concerning Jesus.
This seems to be an influence to his understanding of the Bauer hypothesis, which, again, Heresy of Orthodoxy really does a good job of dismantling, or at least going through the claims of Bauer and then showing how inaccurate he tends to be with his claims.
Right. So instead of being totally influenced by these pagan and Jewish ideas that were floating around, the worship of a crucified and risen Messiah was definitely a unique situation. Right? It was different and incredibly scandalous to all of its audiences, whether they were Jewish or Greek.
Having a small g God in Rome was a normal thing. In fact, Rome said, you can have whatever God that you want as long as you say that Caesar is also God, or that you don't disavow our other gods and become atheists that way. So see, even the Romans, the pagan Romans, didn't like atheists. And so, why were Christians persecuted? Why did Eusebius say, 80 years that I have not that God hasn't faltered for me. Why should I deny him in this time? Having this perspective that comes rooted in a monotheistic religion of Judaism is carried over, and that's clearly seen, especially in the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah. So instead of being influenced by Greek pagans and Jewish concepts, and therefore having Jesus as a small g demigod, Christianity was unique.
Yeah, who are they hiding from then?
They were unique, right? It was unique. It was different and unaccepted by both Greeks and Jews, right?
So secondly, Ehrman's claim, contrary to Ehrman, there is strong evidence that Jesus claimed the prerogatives and identified himself as God. Ehrman's portrait of Jesus gives short shrift to the miracles, actions, and words of Jesus that point to his own divinity. He also does not allow the confessions and worship of Jesus as God by his followers immediately following the resurrection, like Matthew 28:17, Luke 24:52, John 20:28, to contribute sufficiently to the picture. As again, I think I mentioned last episode or the episode before, Thomas says, unless if I thrust my fingers into the side of Jesus, then that's the only way I'll believe. Right. Jesus appears before him. He says, all right, do it. And he says, my Lord and my God. Yeah. So this isn't like, how people would say, oh my God, this is crazy. No, this is titles that he's attributing. And Jesus doesn't go, whoa, hold on. You mean small g? Yeah. So small g God, right?
You mean demigod.
Hold on now. Let's not go too far, Thomas. I've raised myself from the dead and I'm standing before you with holes in me, but let's calm it down. No, that's not the case here.
So, so clearly this allowing for confessions and worship of Jesus as God was right there very early, right? Immediately after the resurrection, right?
We see that in the Corinthians passages, having Paul use a very creedal song used that where it was passed down, that most scholars do agree. Most scholars, scholars am I talking about?
That's right.
Most scholars agree is an infant type of song that the early church sang, and it talks about Jesus' divinity.
Yeah, good. So this is, so again, this is evidence that it wasn't an evolution that Jesus became God, but very early on he was accepted, he was worshipped, and that sort of thing, right? Third, it's implausible that New Testament authors would have included contradictory Christologies, right? That is, conceptions and descriptions of Christ, side by side in the same book, right? These suggest that these ideas are related by the biblical authors to each other and not seen as competing. So here's a couple of examples. John 1 affirms that the Word was God, right? John 1:1. Then later in the same prologue, John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and took up residence among us.
Right.
So he was God, and then he wasn't God, right? Well, which is it? Well, it's both, right? They're side by side. The Word was God, the Word became flesh, right? He was man. Yep. So yes, right there.
Well, in verse 13, John went to go get a drink. He went to the bathroom. He washed his hands. he finished the TV show he was watching, and then he came back and was like, "Well, where was I again?" All right, here we go.
He's a man.
He came down. I guess I don't know. Yeah. Let's keep going. I've got a lot to write here. We've got to get to the end of the book. Colossians 1:19 gives us what Ehrman thinks is completely different from an earlier exaltation Christologies. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Yet later in Colossians 2:12, so again, Colossians 1:19, and yet in 2:12, Paul refers to the exaltation of Christ when God raised him from the dead.
So he is God, right? All the fullness of deity dwells in him, but he isn't God because God raised him from the dead.
Right.
Well, he's both, right? And they're both together in the same passage, right? And these authors don't see this as a contradiction.
Right. And again, it's what we've said on the show before, is that it seems like the inclusion of the doctrine of the Trinity happens in the pages between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a reason you don't see Paul say, okay, hold on, let me pause here and talk about how God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Christ, therefore identifying Jesus as God, and then saying, well, and then you might be confused when I say later that God raised him from the dead. Well, what am I talking about? Here, let me go into a full-on, another book on this. Yeah. No, it seems like there's an understanding. There's no outcry of like, oh, well, we're all monotheists. You don't see that from Hebrews. You see a continuation of these people who need to be exalted not on the nature of who Christ is, but on the nature of what he accomplished. Ehrman's evolutionary theory might have some initial plausibility if these differences were seen only in different books, but the fact that these differences are in the same book makes his theory problematic, to say the least. Right. Not saying it's wrong, we would say it's wrong, but not saying that you can wholly dismiss it, but it seems really interesting here in the scope of a single chapter, and here 2 chapters, that 2 major writers of the New Testament, Paul and John, would conflate these ideas, saying, oh, well, hold on, what I mean is demigod.
Right.
I mean, a little lower than the angels.
Yeah, good. So fourth, Ehrman either misinterprets or fails to engage with several very important passages. Ehrman argues that neither in Matthew nor in Luke is Jesus seen as a pre-existence, right, prior to his birth, but instead becomes divine in some lesser sense of the word. According to Ehrman, the Gospel of Mark also does not view Jesus as pre-existent, and puts his adoption, right, even later than the other synoptics at his baptism, right? So his adoption by God, this is my son. Yeah. He's adopted by God.
This point
at
in
the
history,
baptism, right? Yeah. So he interprets Mark in this way because there is no account of the virgin birth, and he sees the voice of God at Jesus' baptism as marking a declaration, right, that during this event, Jesus is becoming the Son of God. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, right?
However, as Simon Gathercole points out, God says something similar in Mark 9:7. Okay. But clearly Jesus is not being adopted again. He says, it's hard to see how the voice at the baptism could refer to God's adoption of Jesus, and the similar sounding voice at the Transfiguration could mean something different.
Yeah, so is he adopted at the baptism and then readopted at the Transfiguration when God says, "This is my beloved Son"? Here,
listen to him. Yeah. Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
In a key scene in the Synoptics in Matthew 26 and then in Mark 14, Jesus claims he will sit with God in heaven, appealing to Psalm 110, as well as Daniel 7 in Matthew and Mark. The Jewish leaders accused Jesus of blaspheming because this was a claim to be equal to God, and they did not believe he could make this claim. This is equivalent to claiming divinity, and the leaders got the point.
So very early on, there was this claim to divinity.
So right? if we're to listen to critical scholars, the Jewish leaders were the critical scholars. Yeah. They tore their cloaks. They rent them in two, which is what they were. That was that high a blasphemy that even outside the temple, hearing this from a fellow Jew caused them to do something that showed their humility by ripping their vestments. Yeah, and their how egregious this was to them. Right? Yeah. How insulting. Yeah, exactly. So in summary, our position, our book tells us, is that Jesus was not a mere man who became God only later,
In Jesus, God took on humanity in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Also, the types of Christology Ehrman claims as contradictory are found side by side, even intertwined in individual New Testament books, such as John's Gospel or Colossians that we looked at. So apparently these authors held both views simultaneously without considering them contradictory, right? So this calls Ehrman's alleged trajectory of this kind of evolution from exaltation to incarnation Christologies. It calls this into question. All right.